Welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisen, the host of Inside Personal Growth. And joining me today is Peter, I got to get that right first, Peter Kozodoy. He's an author, a speaker, and an entrepreneur. And Peter, tell us where you're joining us from. We always see that lovely background in there, and it's like, oh my goodness, my listeners look like they're saying they'd like to be there.
Yeah, I live right outside New York City in southwestern Connecticut, so on the Long Island Sound.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, that background picture you have of yourself looks great. Looks like either a nice sunrise or sunset. But we're going to be talking to Peter today about his new book called Honesty to Greatness, How Today's Great Leaders Use Brutal Honesty to Achieve Massive Success. And for all of you out there, it's a brand new release. It's a Ben Bella book, and it's on Amazon now. And the book is available for anybody to get. So I'd really encourage you. Can you hold up the book, Peter?
You know what? It's on my shelf back there. I'm sorry.
Oh, you don't have it. Okay. Well, it'd be nice if we had the book, but for my listeners, just imagine that the book is yellow and black, and it's got a little indicator in the middle of it. So definitely look for it. We will put a copy of the book jacket on our blog as well so that you have it. So Peter's mission is to help people use the power of brutal honesty to achieve greatness in their lives and organizations. He spent the last 10 years building multi-million-dollar companies, landing him on the Inc. 5000 list of fastest growing entrepreneurs in America. Now he regularly appears on media shows, and leads strategic honesty workshops and events to achieve massive success. He's been on TedX. He's spoken at Microsoft, CEO clubs. He's written for Forbes, Inc., PR Daily, Huffington Post. And believe me, you're going to really enjoy this interview with Peter about this because, hey, look, Peter, we kind of live in a world today which honesty has been bent.
Certainly has.
And it's probably more than bent. You're wondering, where the heck are the moral leaders? Where are the moral leaders, not only in our country, but we see this happening at rapid rates inside of corporations. You see what happened at Wells Fargo, and we can go on and on and on and on and on with lists of companies that have had less than what I'm going to call moral, honest, and truthful leaders within inside their company. But in the introduction of the book, Sharon Lechter states that we love and work in a society where the phrase honesty is the best policy is usually followed by except when. Why is the value of honesty so important, not only in business, but in all of our relationships, especially in the world today that we're living in? I'm not saying that honesty hasn't been something that's been jacked around with all throughout time, but it seems today with more media, more exposure, more people on Facebook, social media, honesty gets totally bent.
Well, that's the main premise of the book, and what I want people to really understand is that, do I think that we should be like moral, ethical human beings? Yes. That's not why I wrote a book about honesty. I wrote a book about honesty because the difference now is we live in an extremely transparent society. Everyone has a smartphone. Someone, somewhere is recording what is going on. And the truth is coming out. We have that phrase in the English language, the truth always comes out. Well, now it really is. And if you just look back the past few years, the college admissions scandal, the VW diesel emissions scandal, the Wells Fargo fake account scandal, there was a story on the news just this morning. Theranos is back in the news. They lied up and down.
She was a piece of work.
Yeah, but she did it, right? So we have this sort of weird relationship with honesty that we empower these fraudsters to do terrible things. But the difference now is there's too much transparency, too much information flowing. The odds of getting found out now are so high that going forward, it isn't going to pay to do anything but be honest and transparent. And the many, many leaders in my book, CEOs of, Quicken Loans and Sprint and Berkshire Hathaway and Bridgewater Associates, they've all figured this out, and they use honesty, not as a touchy-feely core value, Greg, but as a business strategy to dominate their industry and achieve way more profits than their competitors.
Oh, I mean, you look at it and you look at places like Tom's Shoes, you mentioned that in there
Mm-hmm.
as well. I think there's so many businesses that are really working very diligently at, you know, being extremely honest. I would even say Tim Cook at Apple.
Yeah.
Granted, you sometimes you walk the line politically, but his big honesty statement with Apple has got to be that we're not going to let people have access to the information in the phones, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he took a hard one on that one. So with that being said, how do you really define honesty for our listeners? I mean, there's got to be some way where we can put this in a little bit of a box and tell the listeners what your interpretation of honesty is.
Yeah. So let's first debunk what it is not, because most folks, they hear what I kind of do and they're like, oh, well, what do you want me to be, like some asshole, like say everything that comes to mind? And it's like, no, that's not what honesty means. In
Mhm.
fact, there's a CEO in my book that makes a great point, which is that if you're flying in an airplane and the pilots come over the intercom and they say, folks, we've never seen storm clouds like that before. Please put your seatbelts on. Not quite sure if we're going to get through this. Is that honest? Yes. Is it helpful? No. So instead, we need to understand what honesty is good for. And what it's good for is trust. That's really what's behind being open-minded and willing to admit fault and ready for change and all of the ways that I define honesty. So what I found, Greg, was that you can actually, if you're going to use honesty as a strategy, you can stratify it into 3 distinct layers. And these are the exact layers that the leaders and organizations in my book follow to achieve their groundbreaking success. The first is we need to get honest with and about the level of community. In other words, what's going on in society at large? How are we changing our norms and our social patterns and what's acceptable to us? I mean, there are all kinds of things bubbling up right now, from systemic racism to gender bias to gender fluidity, all these kind of things that are kind of representative of how our social norms are changing. We need to be cognizant of that. We operate in that environment. The second level, Greg, is being honest with and about the others around us. Now, sometimes we do need to be honest with the people in front of us, right? That is what we need to do. But other times we need to be honest about them, about how they're thinking, how they're feeling, how different their thought processes may be from our own, about what compels them to change and how we can adapt our own behavior to help others around us make changes that we know they need to make. This is where empathy comes into play. Right? And folks who understand honesty get really good at being honest about the others. And I'm sure we'll get to that a lot later. And the final step is getting honest with and about yourself, with your own biases and self-limiting beliefs as a leader. Because, Greg, in my tenure from, starting up at, 22, just out of college, to eventually working with, startups of the Fortune 500, I even threw a party for Warren Buffett once. And I will tell you that it was shocking to me that business is not run on logic. It's not run on revenues, profits, losses, spreadsheets, logic, sense, right? Instead, largely it's run on ego and bias, and this is what the leader thinks or feels, and it's total BS. And no one prepared me for that. And what I ultimately decided with many of these organizations, and I'm sure you'll ask me about some juicy stories later, is that it's an honesty issue. It's nothing else, but we are failing to get honest with ourselves. And in those moments, we're failing to see the changes that we need to make.
Agreed. And the point is really it's internal work that has to be done. It's the
Very
personal
much so.
growth that has to be done by the leaders of companies that are willing to actually. The other day I was listening to somebody from the Hoffman Institute. If anybody out there knows who Hoffman Institute is, it's where people go to get truthful in their relationships, meaning their marriage relationships, but they also go there for other things as well. And it transforms people. You tell the great story you said about businesses, and this is Blockbuster and Netflix. You kind of start the book off with it. And honesty is the best policy, but can you relay the story for the listeners? Because this kind of exemplifies the differences.
Yeah, I'm happy
Right?
to. And it's the opening story of the book, the opening story of my TED Talk for a reason. Everyone knows the basics of what happened with Netflix and Blockbuster, right?
Yeah, we
And
know the
then
financial basics.
yeah, and it makes sense intuitively.
Yeah.
What most people don't realize is that Blockbuster had years and years to do something about it. Netflix came and offered themselves up for sale. Blockbuster said no. Netflix came and has said, do you want to partner? Blockbuster said no. Eventually, Blockbuster said, maybe there's something to this. Maybe we should go compete with them. And they started up a program called Total Access. At its height, it had about 2 million subscribers and DVDs through the mail. They'd finally gotten their act together.
Right.
And in came an activist investor who said, no, this isn't how Blockbuster makes money. Blockbuster is this kind of company. People love going to the local store and getting their DVDs. They love paying all those late fees. This is what Blockbuster does. He fired the CEO, installed a new one, and in about a year and a half, they lost the equivalent of the GDP of Monaco. Now Netflix is worth, I think at last count, it was 20 or 30 times what Blockbuster ever was.
Mm-hmm.
And so looking back at it, many folks will say to themselves, well, those executives were just idiots. They were just stupid, right? But when you think about it, it was it was a multi-billion-dollar company. Are you really going to say that a multi-billion-dollar company went out of business because they're stupid? I mean, we're talking about folks who have risen through the ranks to become executives, folks with MBAs and Ivy League degrees and experience and all this stuff. And so that's why, Greg, what I ended up deciding was we are the stupid ones if we think that, we can just blame folks in power for being morons. It's not the way it is. Anyone who rises through the ranks to become, an executive has to be intelligent. I really do believe in my heart of hearts, it is an issue of they failed to get honest with themselves, honest about how consumer trends were shifting, honest about what customers are saying, and what maybe their fellow executives were already knowing and thinking and feeling. And finally, they failed to get honest with themselves that they needed to make a drastic change if they were going to survive. And instead, unable to dislodge themselves from what Warren Buffett calls the institutional imperative, they drifted into oblivion. It's sad, but it happens all the time. It's happening today.
Yes, and you see it happening today, but I think the wake-up call, the whatever it's going to take, the hit in the side of the head to wake up to that, unfortunately for some of these executives, took them way too long. It was an after the fact situation, and that's what you see happen. They ultimately do admit, their biases, their challenges that they had. But it's at a huge expense to investors, to stakeholders, to all kinds of people. Our world today seems to be filled with dishonesty. Let's go to the other side. From CEOs to newscasters to politicians. I mean, look at the whole sex scandal thing, Matt Lauer. It was everywhere. Bill Cosby, who would ever thought, what was going on there? So why do you believe it's so hard for many in positions of this power, right? Because really they are quite powerful. They're either controlling the media, they're controlling constituents that are voting for them and then voting in laws. They're celebrities that people are looking up to that aren't setting great examples. But the positions of power, why in the hell can't they tell the truth?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the blanket answer is they're humans.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are a couple of very interesting phenomena going on in our culture right now that I could talk for hours and hours and hours about. But I'll say a few things. The first is you look at human behavior, right? We've grown into a very advanced culture of animals who love to deny things like, our proclivity to want to have sex with each other, right? We love to pretend that we can snap our fingers and those kinds of desires go away. So I think we have this confluence of there's human behavior and humans wanting to do what humans want to do. And then there's social norms that come over the top of it that are saying, no, we're not supposed to do that anymore. And we know they're in conflict because if it were really that easy, then we wouldn't have things like sex scandals in the year 2020. what we've known for decades, this is wrong. We know we punish this as a society. We know it's bad, and yet it persists. You could say the same thing about things like sexism or racism or any of the other sort of things that we have real trouble eradicating in this society. So I think at some point we have to step back and ask ourselves, what does it honestly take to create change? What does it honestly take to help people
Well,
understand?
I have a question along that line. When
Yeah.
you're speaking about it, you brought it up, the fact that people maybe wanted to have sex with other people. And one of my questions for you was really, it is very timely. A few nights ago, I watched Spotlight, the
Oh
movie
yeah.
Spotlight. If you've never seen it, have you seen it?
I haven't, but I lived
Okay.
in Boston through it.
So it's about the Catholic Church, and Boston Globe exposes these 100 priests and their sexual abuse. How can one of the oldest religions on the planet continue to deceive the public about tremendous amounts of sexual abuse within the church? And what confusion does that cause for believers? Here's the point. There are people that have created a belief in an institution and the people in that institution that it stands so strong for those values that supposedly that institution withheld, but falls so short of.
Mhm.
So my question to you is, if you're going to change something, and you lived in Boston and you saw what was going on, the key to that story was you had to get not to the priests, but to the institution that was covering it up.
Mhm.
Behind every one of these big players is an institution that continues to cover up and actually not tell the truth or be honest.
Yeah.
Again, what's got to happen to the people inside these institutions that continue to proliferate this stuff? Maybe
Yeah.
a redundant question, but it goes along the line with what the hell we're talking about.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say it exactly relates to the earlier question, which is like, why do people struggle so much to be honest? And
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
protectionism,
yeah.
there's, hey, I'm going to save my own skin, which by the way, is what limits organizations from achieving success, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're more obsessed with protection than advancement. That's a problem. And, unfortunately, I think folks confronted with this awful dichotomy of like, oh, we stand for like truth and light and we're abusing these children, freeze. And instead, they would do so much better to reinvent, to come out with all of it, to make drastic changes and to show folks, hey, we know what's going on. We're
Mm-hmm.
fixing it. We are not trying to hide it. And it really comes back to the interpersonal. Like when I talk about honesty as using it as an organization, the idea is this: if I do something to piss you off, Greg, I'm going to call you on the phone. I'm going to say, Greg, I got to tell you this happened. I'm really sorry. And I suck. And I hope you'll forgive me. But if you don't, that's fine. But I really just need to come clean. Like this is how we communicate. This is how we rebuild trust and relationships. Organizations can do the same thing. In fact, I chronicle many who do exactly that in my book and end up just crushing it for being brutally honest about what's going on. So what I wonder about, the Catholic Church in particular is, how much damage could they have avoided if they had just come out with it in the beginning, made structural changes, were really honest with folks? Because it is the repeated abuses, the repeated headlines that shake people.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing that in the presidential race, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
that there was a lot folks excused, and then it was a little less easy to excuse and a little less easy to excuse. And so, it's really it's much easier to rip the Band-Aid off. We know this, by the way, because we have that phrase in the English language. Just rip the Band-Aid off.
Yeah.
And what I hope folks realize is that actually is the best way to protect yourself.
Well, I like how you put it in the book. You say that fraud is our fault.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst part is that most of us don't even know that we're lying. Now, that dishonesty is ingrained in us so deeply that getting it out will take a journey of self-discovery.
Yep.
What is the journey of self-discovery that you're recommending to our listeners to take to actually become brutally honest?
Yeah. Well, and then, before we turn this on, you and I were talking about how important it is to make these ideas actionable, and I couldn't agree more. So I'm going to give you two questions that I want everyone at all times to be asking themselves, which is that true? And how do I know? whether it's a headline coming at you in the nightly news, or it's your great aunt Betty's Facebook post, or it's a thought you have in your head, an assumption that you've made, a belief
Hmm.
that you've harbored. Is it true? And how do you know? Because most often, Greg, unfortunately, it's not true in some way, shape,
Hmm.
or form. And it is up to us to figure out what is true and then to act on honesty, because otherwise we're just going along for the ride. We're empowering people who don't uphold our values and social norms and do things we don't agree with. And it's up to us. We need to understand our mind share counts for something. Every time we click something, watch something, give credence to a fact that's not
Right.
true, we perpetuate the problem.
You know, there was an author, and I can't remember her name right now, so it's passing. She's been on the show many, many years ago. But she used to have a whole seminar series and write books about two questions. Is it true that what you're telling yourself? And then her second question, when she'd get them on stage and she'd put them up on actually right on the stage, is it really true?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Meaning, hey, you've told yourself a story. I think what happens is we like to make stuff up, then we like to believe the stuff we made up,
Yep.
and then we have to make up different stuff from what we made up to get ourselves out of the shit that we had originally made up.
It's
But
like
we're
a
making stuff
tapestry
up
gone
all the
wrong.
time. What?
100%. It's like a
Yeah.
tapestry gone wrong.
It's just it's a crazy thing how much stuff we make up,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And we begin to believe the stuff we make up, which then creates the biases that we've
right.
done because we haven't really questioned what we've made up in our mind.
Yep.
I got a master's degree in spiritual psychology, and the question we used to ask is, do you have to believe everything you think? You don't have to believe everything you think,
That's
but
right.
we think because we think it, we're going to believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it isn't true. It's like those executives you just said who at Blockbuster, they were believing what they thought was right without ever questioning it. And then you tell stories about Theranos, Vice, and The Shed, and you point out the biases that demonstrate how much we're willing to look beyond the surface and believe only what we want to desperately believe in is truth. Can you relay these stories so that the people they can recognize these biases and the difference between truth and honesty? Because these were great stories in your book. I think everybody, well, not everybody knows Theranos, but that girl I think was totally insane, to be honest with you.
And yet,
she had to be
very smart investors too.
very
Hundreds
smart.
of
Yeah, she
millions
got
of dollars out of it.
hundreds of millions of dollars out of people. The Shed story, I didn't know. That was pretty cool as well.
I like to tell that one because not a lot of people know about it, and it's
right.
And all of us can relate because we all go out to eat at dinner at some point in time. So, for many months, the #1 rated restaurant on TripAdvisor in this region of England was called The Shed.
Mm-hmm.
So, when they first opened, they immediately skyrocketed to the top, and it was very difficult to get a reservation. You would call, they barely ever pick up. So this couple finally did get a reservation there. They were like pumped. They're already like tweeting about it and going on Instagram. Can't believe it got reservated. This is awesome.
Right.
Hugely coveted dining spot. So they go, right? They set off 7:00 in the evening. And they're driving through this residential area and coming up on the restaurant. I was thinking, this is kind of odd. I mean, there aren't a lot of restaurants parked in the cul-de-sac of a residential area, but all the more, right? All the more psychological triggers that this must be good. So they pull up, looks like an ordinary house, and they're going to get out of the car and looking around. And then somebody that looks like a host finally comes out from behind the house, walks over and greets them, and takes them by the hand, come back. Their table was ready, so they were able to sit right down in the backyard. And they were situated between this kind of ordinary looking house and a garden shed. Garden shed was kind of run down, rustic, right? So decor was definitely fitting with the vibe. After what seemed like a while, food finally came out. And this couple's like snapping pictures and stories and sharing with all their friends. Awesome. Food wasn't that good, but they figured, what the hell? I mean, this is the place. That's what TripAdvisor said, and all their friends couldn't get a reservation. So, at the end of the night, they went home, gave it 5 stars on TripAdvisor, and raved about it for the few weeks. Now, the best part is, the restaurateur's name was Uba Butler. Uba had never cooked professionally in his life. He had just basically turned his ordinary garden shed into the #1 rated restaurant on TripAdvisor. In fact, the food tasted like frozen TV dinners because that's exactly what they were. And he was able to get away with this for like weeks and weeks and weeks. And people just fell all over it, paying all kinds of crazy prices for this crazy experience. And it just goes to show you that people they don't wake up to this herd mentality that's dragging us all over the cliff.
Yeah. Well, again, if people were brutally honest, what they would have done is give it a 0-star rating.
That's right.
And said, the food here wasn't that good. And by the way, we sat out by an old shed someplace and they
Yep,
charged us
that's right.
exorbitant prices for it. But because somebody had created this sense of wonderment that they were caught up in, they didn't want to be sucked down the rabbit hole and tell the truth. Right?
Well, they would have been a contrarian,
Yeah,
but you look at
exactly.
this plays out all the time, right? Social proof is a very dangerous thing. How did we start our interview? Well, you read all these accolades that I have, and then Inc. 5000 entrepreneur, an MBA from Columbia, and now people are like, oh, this person's someone to listen to. Well, I could have been a bum off the street, and I may have had the most enlightening things to say. So unfortunately, we're all making these snap judgments in our, snap judgment. I want the talking bullet points world, and it's hurting us, Greg. It really is hurting us as a society.
Yeah. Well, to that end, you state that for the first time in human history, something is different about the here and now. And when it comes to the core value of honesty, what in your estimation is changing about being truthful and honest?
Yeah, well, just the sheer amount of transparency. I go back and I tell stories of the Amun priests in Egypt. It used to be that, Egypt, like many other religions, you'd live a pious life. And if you did, then you would get into the afterlife, right? This is a great way to make people behave in a really good way, right? Which we all agree is good. But the Amun priests got wise to this. And they started thinking, all right, well, people want to get into this afterlife thing. We're the gatekeepers for this. Why don't we start charging admission? So they literally would sell pre-made scrolls, sort of tickets to the afterlife, that if you were wealthy enough to buy one, you could behave however the hell you wanted. Get one of these scrolls and you're good to go. So in a world where we don't have perfect information, right? You have something I don't have, you know something I don't know. It's easy to have this sort of perversion between money and morality. It's much more difficult in a world where we can all go to Google and discover the truth pretty quickly. And so, it didn't pay back then to be transparent. You could hide everything and get away with it. Now, much more difficult.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I want to talk about conscious capitalism. And in that light, you mentioned Adam Smith, the founder of capitalism, and you speak with our listeners about capitalism and conscious capitalism and how this will evolve businesses towards honesty. And in that light as well, what are these 4 pillars of conscious capitalism? Because, you obviously are very much a conscious capitalist yourself. I always thought that the conscious capital movement was founded by the guy at Whole Foods, myself, and I realized from your book that it wasn't actually him that started it,
No,
but
he was one of the founding board members.
yeah, but he made it popular, I think. Right. So, what is it about capitalism and conscious capitalism, the differences, and these 4 principles or pillars?
It's a good question because it gives us pause to go back to what we said at the very beginning, which is that this is not, an ethics and morals book. It's a how do we achieve outcomes book. I'm a capitalist as much as the next guy. I love profit. I do not say the F word, which is free. I don't say it. So, I'm all about generating sales, generating revenue. That's what this book is about. So what we have to realize, though, is that consumers simply know more than they've ever known before. We have folks my age, millennials, and of course Gen Z, making purchasing decisions based on whether a company pollutes a river in Zimbabwe. We know that now. We can track that data. So the more data we have about companies, the more we know 2 things. From an investor standpoint, we know what drives performance in a way that we did not know before. And we also know what drives consumerism, right? Consumer choices and decision-making behavior, right?
Right.
Those change based on the amount of information that's available. And so, conscious capitalism is a perfect framework for us to think about how are we going to structure our companies around, they have 4 pillars, which I think are helpful. One is, higher purpose. What are we doing here besides making money? Number 2 is stakeholder orientation. How are we making sure we benefit all the stakeholders, not just the investors, but our employees, our partners, our suppliers, our planet, by the way. The third is conscious leadership, having someone in power who is not sucked into their own biases and ego and self-limiting beliefs, who's actually empowering the others around them to bring choices and to act on those choices. And I tell a lot of great stories in my books of cultures like Quicken Loans and Ritz-Carlton and more that are built that way. And finally, conscious culture. How do you set up a framework, a set of values and beliefs within an organization, and then actually act on those with integrity, not just posting, our 3 crappy core values on the wall that everyone knows we don't really do. That's even more harmful than if you didn't have core values in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, the point for any organization is when you do the purpose and the mission statement and the values is to live them and to have inclusion with the people that are working for you to agree that those are the same values, or they work in a department where there's values that are similar to yours. That is the whole point of this. Now, you talked about this just capital that was formed by Paul Tudor Jones II, Arianna Huffington, Ronaldo Brudicol, I know Ronaldo, he's up in Santa Barbara, and Deepak Chopra. What is just capital, and why is this important in doing this kind of honesty factor, the way that they've set this up to say, hey, look, we kind of vet these organizations and companies, right? So I wanted to learn more about it. I didn't know anything about it myself, to be honest with you.
I would expect no less.
Yeah. So speak about it. Tell the
Yeah.
listeners a little bit more about the formation of this, what these guys are doing, why they're doing it, what's the purpose of it, how they might even be able to get involved.
Yeah. So Just Capital is a nonprofit that was started to track what they consider to be just companies, right? Companies that act with honesty, integrity, and all the things that we'd want. Cleverly, they realized something very, very important. They got honest about something that many organizations actually fail to get honest about, which is that their opinions actually don't matter at all. The only opinions that do matter are the opinions of the American people. The American people are the ones who are consuming, who are judging companies, and deciding how just they are or are not. So, what Just Capital does first is it goes out to the American public and says, what do you care about? Do you care about workers' rights? Do you care about environmentalism? Do you care about, what is it? And so the American public gives them a stack rank of issues that are important to them. And then Just Capital goes out and drives at the data of the largest companies in the US to figure out which ones match what Americans care about, and which ones are actually taking care of employees and actually taking care of the environment, and so on and so forth. And so it creates the Just 100, the 100 most just companies out there. And what's fascinating, Greg, is that
is it similar to socially responsible investing in that?
Yeah, it's a very, so they actually did launch their own ESG ETF, which is a fancy way of saying a fund that is composed of social and economic, social environmental type equities. But yeah, completely. And what's interesting is that being just, paying your workers more, going the extra mile to make sure your carbon footprint's smaller, doesn't cost these companies anything. In fact, they end up making
more money,
a higher return on equity than the rest of them.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at them like Costco and Tom's Shoes and all of them, they give reasonable salaries to their employees. They treat them right. They give them great 401k plans and benefits. If you really look at all the factors that you might be judging in that respect, I did an interview not that long ago with a guy that wrote a book called The Amare Way. which was about the love in the companies and how
Nice.
having love in these companies really does affect the bottom line of the business,
It
right?
does.
And so we're talking about being honest. So maybe it's being honest and having love and compassion with inside your organization, because we're at the tipping point of actually a whole new world here. We
Agreed.
see all these old structures being broken down, and they're going to have to be rebuilt. And they're going to be rebuilt in a whole new way that doesn't include much of what we had in the past. We also, in my estimation, I think we're seeing the kind of crumbling, just as my own personal commentary, of a great superpower, which was the US, which is not going to continue to maintain that status under current administration. And I don't even think with the change of the administration, we're going to see that, because we're looking for equanimity. We're looking for more of the world to become together united, right? I remember, and you might remember this, again, more commentary, and then I'll get to my last question, Bucky Fuller. He said, if we spend more on livingry than we do on weaponry, and that's what he did. He called it weaponry, meaning the bombs and the military and the forces and whatever. There isn't a person out there in the world that couldn't eat. There isn't a person out there that couldn't have electricity and running water.
Yep.
They couldn't have a toilet. They couldn't have what should happen. And that's where we really need to get brutally honest with ourselves is,
Agreed.
how are we going to make that happen around the world? Now, if you're going to leave our listeners with actionable steps, because we said this was an actionable interview for our listeners, that they could take to become brutally honest with themselves, this self-check-in. I love the question, is it true? Is it
And how do
really
you
true?
know?
What advice would you leave them with in kind of wrapping this up? Where do you want to take it? Let's say we've got a bunch of people that own businesses out there that are listening today. And I don't care if it's a mom and pop business or if it's a multi-million-dollar business.
Yeah.
What are you going to advise these? Because it really comes down to it. You said it many times during this interview. We're human beings.
That's right.
And it's all about how we build relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And if we want to keep those relationships, we've got to have actionable steps to figure out how to do that.
That's right. And I want to talk about one relationship in particular that very few people ever think about, which is the relationship you have with your blind spot. Everything, when you think about like how we make decisions and take actions, that's all on things we understand, right? Like we take in inputs, we see where we are in life, we make a decision, right? What we don't stop to think about is get honest about what might be under the surface, what might be in our blind spot, driving how we think, how we feel, how we act. And until we shine a spotlight in there, it's very difficult for people to make drastic changes in their life. If people really want to lose 50 pounds, if they really want to make a career change, if they really want to restructure their business so it can go from 2 million to 10 million and 20, like it takes a tremendous amount of honesty and looking into the blind spot, because if you knew what was there, you would have made the change already.
Mm-hmm.
The way I solve that, Greg, for business owners, you bring up business owners, is I run what's called forum. Once a month. In fact, tonight is one of my monthly forums. We get together on Zoom. It's 100% confidential, and we get 100% vulnerable about what's honestly going on with our business, with our personal lives.
And for my listeners, not to interrupt, but we will put a link to Peter's. We're going to have links to all of this, so they're not going to miss out. If they want to sign up and come into one of your forums or join your forums, they can learn how to do that, right?
Yeah, because I've not found another way. What I needed, Greg, to get honest with myself, my quarter life crisis at 30, which is in the book, don't worry, was a group of other founders in a safe space where I could speak things that I was even pretending didn't exist in my own head, right?
Mm-hmm.
And once I was encouraged to do that and put it out on the table, it's like, oh, now I can deal with this, right? Now I've been encouraged to get it out there and it's acceptable. And we don't have that opportunity because we're too busy pretending to be, Instagram fine and everything's good. How are you doing? Right? Hey, Greg, how are things today? Good. Are they really good? I hate that automatic response. And in that automatic response, we lose a lot of the ability to build the relationships you talked about and to actually create meaningful change in our lives and businesses.
Well, I think the memes, the hardwiring of our brains, the way we've come along as human beings. I love the evolution. You know, there's a huge difference between our ages. Obviously, people can look at the screen and see that. But the reality is I think for consciously aware individuals at my end of the spectrum, we're loving seeing what's going on. We really appreciate what this generation is doing to bring light to this. And I'm going to hold this up because I don't have the book. So at least there's a little bit of something there. I would tell all of my listeners, please go out and get Honesty to Greatness. We'll have a link to the Amazon page for this. We'll also put a link to Peter's website as well. And also for you to link in to his forums. We'll do all those and any other links that we get from Peter as well. Thank you so much for being on. It's really refreshing to have a conversation. And I think, the brutal honesty, about this pandemic. Through this whole time, we didn't talk anything about the pandemic. So I'm going to put a last little bit of commentary on here because I really appreciated what Bill Maher said just the other day. He said, if all these people had really gotten brutally honest and had advice for people getting healthy, and if Americans had started diets and exercise programs and whatever, because statistics are showing that people that are just way obese are the ones that are actually dying from the disease, and ones that are even somewhat obese are more susceptible to getting, probably not dying. But the reality was, as he said, this was a health crisis, not a pandemic around that. And, I thought that he said, but nobody, Peter, wanted to get brutally honest and tell that story. It was the rush toward the vaccine. It was whatever. And some of my listeners may say, well, they don't like Bill Maher. I don't really care because I believe, now again, it's my bias, but I do believe the statistics, if you want to go look it up, prove that. They say that that's the case. Any last minute commentary on that?
Well, there are a lot of issues with the pandemic. One of the things I've been saying in a lot of the TV and radio interviews I'm doing is before there was a pandemic of COVID-19, there was a pandemic of dishonesty, which is why when folks said to America, hey, we have a problem here and we need you to do the following things and we need you to help, everyone looked at it and said, we don't know if we can trust you.
Yeah.
And now what's made it worse is, I just learned about an NBC news anchor that said he had COVID for 5 weeks and reported on that. Turns out he got tested 5 times, never had COVID. It's like, how do we keep eroding trust this way? It's only going to, what I worry about, Greg, in all of that is, if you look at the numbers, look at the death rates, terrible. If you had a family member die, of course it's horrible. But statistically speaking, there are more contagious diseases, there are more deadly diseases. And when a more contagious, deadly disease comes around, and eventually it will, what are we all going to do? We're going to look at it and be like, well, maybe it wasn't that big of a deal the first time. We didn't know who to trust the first time. The stats were all skewed the first time. So now I don't know if I'm going to listen to you or not. That's super, super dangerous. That's what worries me.
Totally. I totally hear what you're saying. And the question is what's coming to mind for me is, when's there going to be transparency and when are people going to wake up?
Yeah.
And I don't know about the slap on the head of anyone else, but maybe it's just the slap on the head of ourselves.
Totally.
To question more things and to do more research before we just follow down the pathway and do it blindly.
Yep.
And that's probably the biggest bias, is that blind trust that people fall into for some reason. And I don't believe it's always because it's weak. They're weak. I believe it's because of a lot of laziness.
Yeah.
It takes more time to do what you and I are talking about. It takes more time to put that into it, but I think you have to be willing to do it. And Peter, I'm going to just say it's been a pleasure having you on. Awesome interview. Thanks for your time this morning with our listeners. Everybody out there, go get the book. We'll put a link to it. And you can go to Peter's website as well. It's full of resources, plenty of stuff for you guys to take a look at. We'll also put a link to that TEDx talk as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Greg.
You're welcome. Take care.